Steve's an environmental scientist at the Department of Fish and Game in the Office of Spill Prevention and Response, and he's been working on the ballast water program there.
Thank you, Susan. I'm actually glad to stand up. I was getting a stiff neck there looking up at the screen. Let's see if I can find my presentation. Okay, contact. I'm glad to be here today to talk to you about our surveys of non-indigenous species in the coastal waters of California. If you were planning to see Mike Sobey give a talk today, he couldn't make it, so I'm a last-minute substitute for him. I'd like to point out that this is a collaborative effort. We work very closely with the Moss Landing Marine Lab, and they do most of our field sampling for us. And I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues at Fish and Game. And actually looking at this list, I realize I'm lowest on seniority, which I think explains why I'm here today. So this program started in 1999 with the Ballast Water Act, and that provided funding to Fish and Game to conduct biological assessments to identify non-indigenous species, or NIS. And I'll actually point out right here that I'll be using a variety of synonyms for non-indigenous species today, non-native species, introduced species, essentially the same thing. So the questions we ultimately wanted to address were, to what extent has the California coast been invaded? And then also, which non-indigenous species have arrived in California via ballast water? So to answer these questions, we first needed to determine the location of all the non-indigenous aquatic populations in the estuarine and coastal waters of the state, and then put that information in a database. So the initial study was directed at inshore, marine, and estuarine waters of the state, and was designed to develop an NIS baseline for the state database. The initial NIS sampling program focused on 7 major ports and estuaries where ballast water is most likely discharged. The field sampling was conducted at all sites with the exception of San Francisco Bay, where a baseline had already been established by a 1995 study by Cohen and Carlton. So these are our primary sites, and they included Humboldt Bay, Port of Sacramento, Port of Stockton, and San Francisco Bay, for which we had a previous baseline, Port Hueneme, LA Long Beach Harbor, and San Diego Bay. So there were 4 biological communities that we examined at each primary site, and these included the fouling community, the soft bottom infaunal community. Here you can see the crew taking a sediment sample, nectin, and also plankton, which we sample quarterly. So we used a combination of field sampling and literature review to determine the presence and location of members of each one of these communities. So our next survey had 15 secondary sampling sites, with the goal of examining the distribution of non-indigenous species by non-ballast water mechanisms. So this survey focused on the smaller bays, harbors, and estuaries. And the investigation was supplemented with data from a rapid assessment survey of several southern California bays and harbors, which was conducted by Dr. Andy Cohen, and also by studies of the Port of LA and Long Beach, and also a SQUIRP study. SQUIRP is the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, and that's also called the Bite 98 study. So that's kind of our MO. We'll take data or use other studies that are out there to kind of conserve our time and resources. Here's a map of our secondary sites, and once we combine these with our primary sites, we have a very good coverage of the coast. And you can also see, I think, well, maybe you can't, but We also have a site at Avalon Harbor on Catalina Island. It's a little hard to pick up right here. So we placed identified species into one of three categories. The first is non-indigenous or introduced species, and these are plants and animals that are living outside their natural geographic range. And for the sake of this, our definition of non-indigenous then is from outside the boundaries of California. Another category is cryptogenic species, and these are organisms that are neither demonstrably native nor introduced. And one example would be a species which has been identified, but for which we don't know its native range or region. And a third category is unresolved taxa. And now these are organisms that cannot be identified to species level. So we don't even venture a guess as to their status. This little critter pictured on the screen here is one of our non-indigenous polychaete worms. And this group of organisms has been problematic for us. Many of them have not been described before, and so many of these actually fall into the cryptogenic or unresolved categories. So here are some of our results from our initial survey. We identified 378 non-indigenous species and 245 cryptogenic species statewide. And the dominant groups included annelids, or worms, and crustaceans. And the most common mechanisms or vectors of introduction included fouling, ballast water, and aquaculture. So two of the top mechanisms are shipping related. And this image here, you can see an example of fouling on a tugboat propeller. This table shows the number of species we identified from each of our primary sites. You can see that, let's see, I'll try and use a pointer here. Yes, careful in the front row. San Francisco Bay is heavily invaded, 180 species. And another thing that you can see here is that almost every site has pretty high numbers of non-native species. Now, another thing I want to point out here is that in some ports, the number of cryptogenic species actually exceeds the number of introduced species, such as at Port Hueneme. So this histogram shows introduced and cryptogenic species collected at each secondary site. Most of the smaller bays and harbors had substantial numbers of non-native species, and hull fouling was the leading mechanism for these introductions. So recreational and commercial fishing boats may be the culprit here. So you can see that Channel Islands Harbor really leads the way with over 40 probable non-native species, but you can also see that there are quite a few other bays that have substantial numbers of non-natives. So we had some new legislation that came along in 2003, and this is a little bit of review. Moria covered some of this. The Marine Invasive Species Act, which really expanded the scope of our study to include the effect of coastwise shipping traffic. So this legislation called for us to develop an NAS baseline for the open coast region of the state. And we were also directed to revisit the bay and estuary locations that were previously sampled. And then 3 years later, we'll actually revisit these the open coast locations. So a little bit about our open coast sampling program. We sampled 22 sites along the outer coast from Mexico to Oregon. And at each site, rocky and sandy intertidal and subtidal stations were sampled. And a total of 31 non-native species and 194 cryptogenic species were collected along the open coast, which is relatively few compared to the bays and the harbors. The most common non-natives were bryozoans and arthropods. And we did have a high number of unresolved taxa. 558 unresolved taxa were collected, which is a relatively high number, and it really is a problem for us, and it's one which we are addressing. So the initial sampling was completed in 2005, and we're going to have follow-up sampling beginning in 2007. And this picture here was taken in January 2005, one of our sites at Arroyo Hondo, and that was a rather high precipitation period. As you can see, the freshwater outflow is pretty substantial. So here we're contemplating how we're going to get across the stream to get to our sampling site, and we're looking upstream to see if maybe there's another path, and there wasn't. So I think we wisely decided to turn back and found an alternate site. Figured that the lives of 3 biologists wasn't worth it. So. Here's a quick look at our open coast sampling sites, and you can see that we have most of the coast pretty well covered. So once we had a baseline for the harbors, bays, and open coast, we began our monitoring program. And one question we wanted to answer with our long-term monitoring was, is the rate of new introductions increasing or not? And so the plan is to return to all the sites previously sampled. And one area that we've recently surveyed is San Francisco Bay. That sampling was completed in 2005. We sampled 120 sites, and we sampled a variety of habitats, including the rocky intertidal, which is pictured here, the sandy intertidal, fouling community, and also the benthic soft bottom. So all remaining harbors and bays will be sampled, and in fact are being sampled as we speak, and that includes the 6 remaining primary sites and also the 15 secondary sites. So our data, which is continually being added to and refined, can be found on the Department of Fish and Game Office of Spill Prevention and Response website, and we have a relational database, and as well as our 2002 report to the legislature. So our website, www.dfg.ca.gov/OSPR, and once you're there, find the link to invasive species. And I'll flash that website at the end again for you. There, as Maury indicated, there is some new legislation recently passed, very recently, signed. Senate Bill 497, the Coastal Ecosystem Protection Act. And this bill removes the sunset date, so effectively extends our monitoring, and that longer horizon will give us the opportunity to gauge the effect of ballast water controls, and also to determine the rate of coastal introductions. So here again is our website, and with that, I guess I'll hold off on taking questions till the end. Is that right? Okay, thank you.